It is my distinct pleasure to introduce the next speaker in the HEC series with Green College. It is Jonathan Hive. He's a leading researcher in moral psychology. He's at the University of Virginia and visiting the NYU Stern School of Business. Recently had a book come out, The Righteous Mind, and on its opening week, it made it number 6 on the New York Times bestseller list. He's already had a conversation with Bill Moyer. He's going to have a conversation with Stephen Colbert coming up. But before that, we're going to give him the UBC bump. So, without further ado, let me just pass it over to Jonathan.
Okay, good. Thanks so much. Okay, so I was expecting this to be like a small seminar where I could present some ideas in progress and get critical feedback from a few experts. And so I was going to start by just apologizing that I put this talk together literally in the last few days. This is the first time I've given it, so it doesn't have all the bells and whistles and cool animations and beautiful pictures. But I thought, since it's just going to be 15 or 20 sort of experts and we're sitting around a table, it's no problem. This is a story which is it's a complicated story, but what I'm trying to do is make it intuitively plausible. So let's see. First, a couple of questions. How many of you more or less know what gene culture coevolution is? Raise your hand. Okay, most of you. So a lot of you guys come to this seminar regularly, I guess. Okay. And how many of you read the chapter that I sent around, chapter 9 from my book? Okay, so most of you did not. Fine. It was fine. I'll just sulk and go home. Okay. Well, so what I'm going to try to do today is tell you the story of an idea. I think it's one of the top 5 or 10 ideas. I mean, after evolution itself, I think it's one of the top 5 or 10 ideas in the social sciences, or at least it could be. I mean, I think multi-level selection is true, and I'm going to try to explain it in a way that I think you'll see its importance, if it's true. Again, I can't be certain that we are products of multi-level selection, but I'm going to make the case that we are. And raise your hand if you were in my talk this morning. Okay, so a little under half of you. So as those of you who are there know, that one of the fundamental rules of human psychology is the confirmation bias. We're all really good at finding evidence for our ideas, and we depend on others to find the contradictory evidence. It's very hard to find evidence against our ideas. So I am hopeful that you guys will counteract my confirmation bias by being critical about this. Again, I lay out the argument in as much detail as I can in the book, but this is the first time I'm doing it as a talk to make the story coherent. And if you see holes in it, if you know of other evidence, please, in the discussion, say so. What's our time frame? How much time? When do we end? Hour and a half. Very good. Okay. 6. Very good. Okay. So the story of an idea in 5 acts, and then if we have time, I'll give one application, which is what I'm calling Hive psychology. Let's see. Okay, so here's the story. Act 1. Charles Darwin, first he writes The Origin of Species, but then he writes Descent of Man, in which he tries to apply all these evolutionary ideas to humans. And he knew even in Origin of Species that morality or cooperation, altruism in the other animals is a problem for his theory. Not that he doubts that he can explain it, but he knows he has to, and he's not sure how. So in Descent of Man, he wrestles with the problem, especially in Book 5. He proposes all kinds of different explanations, and most of these explanations are what you would call individual level selection explanations. So for example, he's a Victorian, he's writing in Victorian times. Reputation is supremely important to a gentleman in the Victorian era, and Darwin recognizes that earlier humans might do good for others because if it enhances the reputation, then all kinds of good things come to them. So altruism done to enhance your own reputation, that's not a paradox, that's not a problem for his theory. If it's survival of the fittest, not his phrase, but I think did he actually use the phrase? I think he did. Anyone know? I know he invented it, but did Darwin ever use it? But okay. All right. At any rate, others used it to describe Darwin's theory. I'm not sure whether Darwin endorsed that phrase, but at any rate. So while wrestling with all these possible explanations for why there is so much cooperation and altruism and virtue in the world, he raises in 3 or 4 different places, it's not just one paragraph, in 3 or 4 different places he raises this idea that groups compete with groups, and he explores that as one of the mechanisms that might have transmitted, he didn't know about genes, but that might have transmitted a trait, descent with modification. especially for some virtues that don't seem directly to benefit the self. And so here's the crucial passage, which is very often quoted, but there's 3 or 4 others that are like it elsewhere in the book. When 2 tribes of primeval man living in the same country came into competition, if the one tribe included a great number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members who were always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other, this tribe would succeed better and conquer the other. So he's proposing that if, as long as you've got competition between groups, if one has certain features that bind it more tightly, it's going to win, conquer, and just as he's been thinking for decades now about individual animals being more fit, out competing another one, so now he's just applying the same logic to groups. And then he's got this great line, selfish and contentious people will not cohere, and without coherence, nothing can be effected. A tribe rich in the above qualities would spread and be victorious over other tribes. So in other words, Darwin was suggesting, well, group selection is what people long called it, but we can use the term multi-level selection as the more general term, just that there's selection going on at multiple levels. Sometimes genes compete with genes within a single organism, but especially individuals compete with individuals. That's the level we're used to looking at. And then Darwin is saying, but also at the same time, groups are competing with groups. You can see it here. I mean, the best metaphor I can think of is imagine any sort of sports team. And a crew team is the best one to think of, I think. So these guys they're rowers on a crew team. And as in all groups, especially a group of young guys, there's some competition among them. They can't all make varsity. So the weakest or the worst of them will get cut from the team. They can't all be the captain of the team. They can't all make it onto the Olympic trials, and if they get to the Olympic trials, they can't all make it into the U.S. Olympic team or whatever nation they're from. So there's competition among them, and it might be beneficial for each individual. There are times when he might want to badmouth the other guy, one of the other guys on it, maybe his rival for a certain spot. So there are individual level motives to get ahead by hurting his teammates. But at the same time that competition is going on within the boat, there's competition across boats. And now suppose in this particular boat race, suppose you have 50 boats start and there's a race, and when they cross the finish line, the last 5 boats to cross, everybody is killed and sunk to the bottom of the Charles River. Now you can imagine in this case that boats that have more than one free rider, slacker, mean guy who tries to beat out his buddy, those boats tend to get wiped out. So if there are occasional mutations that lead to selfishness, normally they will spread through a population, but if you have a weed-out mechanism so that any boat or any group that has more than 1 or 2 of these cheaters or defectors in it, if those get wiped out, well then the gene for the trait of selfishness is not going to spread through the population. And that was basically Darwin's logic, multi-level selection. So that was Act 1. Hold on a second, did I hope this is the right, well, let's see, I think it should be. Okay, so that is Act 1, Darwin proposed that, I thought this was Act 2, oh, I hope this is the right file, did I? Hold on a second, let me just make sure this is the right file. No, this should be a UBC Groupish gene. Okay, I thought I made changes, I hope I didn't lose the changes. All right, anyway, okay. All right, it should be more or less the same. All right, so then group selection, oh no, this is definitely not the right file. I'm so sorry. Let me just take a quick look here because I mean, this should work, but I made a bunch of improvements. What's today? Is today the 2nd? Okay. There we are. Let's use this one. Okay. Okay, there we go. Okay. There we go. Very good. All right. So that was Act 1. Darwin proposed the explanation. Act 2, group selection proliferates. And so in the ensuing years up to the 60s and 70s, you get all kinds of claims about virtue among the animals. Animals seem to be showing many of the virtues that people show. You get theories about why is it that birds will not breed as much as they can, or animals will not overgraze or eat everything they can? Well, it must be for the good of the group. You get all these sorts of claims proliferating, and Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene describes this period. He says, in the intervening years since Darwin have seen an astonishing retreat from its individual-centered stand, a lapse into sloppily unconscious group selectionism. And he's right. This is very sloppy group selectionism, sort of Panglossian, oh, well, if animals do it, it must be for the good of the group. And no, animals will only work for the good of the group in very, very special circumstances. And there's all kinds of features that have to be in place before you can get evolution for the good of the group. And in fact, that's what we're here to talk about today, is it ever possible to get behavior for the good of the group evolving? So Dawkins is right that there was a lot of bad thinking going on, and this bad thinking is what motivated George Williams to write Adaptation and Natural Selection. In fact, in the introduction to it, he describes how he attended a lecture by a termite specialist who talked about how the termites will die to make room for the next generation, and he applied that to other species and said, he took the termites to be a model for other species that don't have the same reproductive structure. So it was very sloppy thinking, and Williams even conveys a bit of disgust for this kind of thinking. And he says he set out to purge, he uses the word purge, metaphors of purity, cleanliness, get rid of this dirty, ugly, degraded thinking. And so he says, he talks about multi-level selection, group selection, and he says, there could be, in principle, group-related adaptations. All these guys, Dawkins, Williams, all of them agree that group selection is possible in theory, but Williams then says, chapters 5 to 8 will be primarily a defense of the thesis that group-related adaptations do not, in fact, exist. So everyone agrees it's possible in principle if you get the constraints right, and then the question is, does that ever happen in the natural world? And both of these books are sort of, romps through the natural world. Oh, here's something that looks like it might be cooperative or might be group, but is it really? Let's look closer. No, it's not. Now let's look over here. Oh, here's something. So both of them go through this and sort of debunk all these cases of apparent altruism, cooperation. In fact, in a later article, Williams wrote, morality is an accidental capability produced in its boundless stupidity by a biological process that is normally opposed to the expression of such a capability. So he does not think that morality is an adaptation. Dawkins similarly says, let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. So this is a very cynical view of human nature. Not that cynical makes it wrong at all. I'm just saying this is the ethos. And the basic argument, there are many arguments against group selection that they raise, but the main one that they raise, and Darwin raised it too, Darwin was very well aware of this, is the free rider problem. I'm about to show you a little simulation that I just commissioned from a friend of mine using agent-based models. And you're going to see the blue cells. Let's suppose these are primitive bacteria or something. They could be anything. But the blue cells are cooperators. That means that when they interact with each other, there's a positive sum. So they generate wealth every time they touch. But then you'll see at the beginning, the simulation starts off with one green cell. A green is an exploiter. When a green touches a blue, it gains wealth at the expense of the blue. And as these little creatures gain wealth, they grow. Once they've doubled in size, they split. That's how reproduction happens in this model. And let's see what happens. Well, you know what happens. You've all at least read about this, but you might not have seen it visually. I think it's fun to see it visually. So if you start with just one green, as it interacts with the blues, it gains wealth, reproduces, and there's a kind of a tipping point right now where it's an exponential sort of curve. So pretty soon, it's all greens. That's the basic process that everybody is talking about. Free riders doom cooperation, because cooperators will be suckers, and so the gene for cooperation can't evolve. So the case against group selection, there are many things raised, but this is the main one. In fact, in the God Delusion, where Richard Dawkins raises group selection, this is the only argument he gives against it, as the free rider problem. There's a bunch of other things discussed. So group selection only really can work if there's intergroup competition, and anthropology in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s believed that warfare was not common in our ancestry. It's only once you get property and land and territory, then war becomes very common. The anthropologist Keeley writes about this, about how how much resistance there was to his findings, that is, wherever you look, as far back as you go, you find evidence of war in human societies. So anyway, warfare is not frequent. Humans are like other mammals is the assumption. So if we look at what all these other animals are doing, that will tell us about the evolutionary processes that gave rise to us. Eusociality was thought to be caused by haplodiploidy. That's what I learned in college. The reason why bees and ants are so cooperative is because they share 3/4 of their genes. So there were a lot of, and what last, there's not been enough time for group selection to occur, in part because, well, if groups are not stable and if evolution's really slow, you just couldn't possibly get it going. I'm sorry, that's actually a slightly different argument. But the point is, there are all these assumptions that were made back in the 60s and 70s when Dawkins and Williams were rejecting group selection. And as I'll show you as we go on, all of these turn out to not be true. Okay, so now we're up to Act 4, because remember, once the purge went through, group selection was dead. Nobody talked about it except for David Sloan Wilson and a couple other people. But basically, scientists could sort of get on with their work and just ignore Wilson the gadfly. And it was really spectacularly productive to make this assumption that genes are selfish. There's no debate there, but selfish genes make basically selfish individuals, with the exceptions of kin selection, reciprocal altruism, a few other things. So we have this golden age of methodological individualism. Once all the social sciences are on the same page, and you can model individual agents pursuing self-interest. And as computers are coming into play, so that lots of social sciences are beginning to do models. So in evolutionary biology, it's all put on this clear, simple, straightforward, clean theoretical footing. Economics simultaneously is honing in on rational choice theory, just model individual behavior as though people are utility maximizers and then let them go at it. In political science, you get rational actor theory, that people take political stances to maximize their self-interest. As I said this morning, politics, at least at the national level, I think is much more like religion than it is like shopping, but the political scientists back then thought that it was more like shopping. In social psychology, this was especially surprising to me. I got into moral psychology in 1987, and equity theory was one of the big social psych theories in morality. And equity theory, so this is a theory about fairness. This is the main social psych theory about the psychology of fairness, Walster and Burscheid. And they say, in their big theoretical paper, they say, theories in a wide variety of disciplines rest on the assumption that man is selfish. And they posit as an axiom that people try to get as much as they can. And so to the extent that people behave fairly sometimes, it must be because fair behavior will get them more stuff in the long run. I mean, this is just an axiom. And they appeal to all the other social sciences for verification. Well, of course, everybody thinks this. Also during this period, the methodological individualism phase, social psychology shrinks down. It used to study people and interaction. All the great studies that we show to our students in our social psych classes, they all involve real people interacting in compelling situations. We never show videos of a single sophomore sitting at a computer pressing buttons. But that's what social psych has become. Sophomores, or sometimes freshmen, pressing buttons. So everything is shrinking down to this sort of idea of lone individuals. Does that sound familiar to some people in this room? Well, first, let me, if there were a few people who objected to this trend, Don Campbell, one of the great thinkers in social psychology, he nailed it. He says, this is writing in 1994, methodological individualism dominates our neighboring fields. So all the other social sciences are methodological individualism. He says, this is the dogma that all human social group processes are to be explained by laws of individual behavior, that groups and social organizations have no ontological reality. Sure, it might look like there's a group, but really, analytically, if we just look at the behavior of the individual, we can model and recreate the behavior what looks like a group. And he says that where used, references to organizations and be a typo there, sorry, are but convenient summaries of individual behavior. So this is, again, a great simplifying assumption which allows all the social sciences to talk together, work together, simple models, they can be programmed on computers. Now, when I said familiar to people in this room, all of you guys know the critique that, that people like us think differently than most people. And one of the things we tend to do is see individual elements in categories. We're not as good at seeing holistic patterns and relationships. And so the social sciences basically got really, really weird. I mean, this is the sort of logical endpoint of weird social science. Methodological individualism. It's not social anymore. Now it's just, well, anyway, enough about that. All right, so that was Act 4. We had this long period of fairly productive social science research, but I think, I was studying morality, and it just didn't make sense to me. It just didn't seem to fit with what else I was seeing. So Act 5, and this is what I really want to focus on today. Where we are now is in 2012. several of us are filing a petition for a retrial of the conviction of group selection. It was convicted, banished in between 66 and 76. And my book just came out in chapter 9, which I sent around. And I guess, Adam, maybe you'll find a way to make that available to anybody else who wants it. My book just came out a couple weeks ago. E.O. Wilson's book, The Social Conquest of Earth, is about to come out. He also makes a very strong case that you need group selection to explain a lot of animal behavior and human behavior. And then a month after that, Chris Bohm's book. He's an anthropologist who studied hunter-gatherers and worked with Jane Goodall on chimpanzees. And he too concludes that, at least for humans, not for other animals, but for humans, you need to invoke group selection. Groups are competing. Groups are structuring themselves, shaping themselves. So this is the year, I think, that the battle. Well, which metaphor should I pick? I'll stick with the courtroom metaphor. This is the year in which the trial will take place, and we'll see a year or two from now what the jury, which is the whole community of scientists and social scientists, think. So here's why. Now we want to really focus us in. What is at stake here? So everybody agrees that group selection, or multi-level selection, including groups, is possible in principle. I don't think there's any major players who say, no, mathematically, the math comes from Price, I think it's not. So everyone agrees it's possible. Historically speaking, the consensus that was reached was that individual level selection is so strong, everyone grants that, individual selection is very, very strong. It's so strong, and group selection is so weak that even if there's a little bit going on, it's so weak it gets swamped, we can ignore it, it's not relevant. Okay, that's what happened historically. But my claim for the next half hour, or 20 minutes, is that actually there's a lot of new evidence that was not available in 1976. That this consensus was not just premature, but wrong. That actually, for humans, group selective processes are much stronger than were thought, and individual selective processes are weaker. So you guys are the grand jury. What do you think? This is just my opening appeal. Do you think we should reopen the case, or do you think that once science has decided something, it's done and we should not revisit it? Please raise your hand if you think we should reopen the case. Okay, let us proceed. Okay. So, in the case of Wilson v. Dawkins, 2012, you, the jury, will decide one question of fact. There is just one question you are charged with deciding. And that is, were groups vehicles for human genes? That's it. That's all you have to decide. Let me explain. Here's a quote from the Extended Phenotype. I love Dawkins' distinction between replicators and vehicles. DNA is a replicator. There can be other replicators. He talks about cultural replicators. But for biological evolution, DNA is the replicator. It has very high fidelity. It can make copies of itself. Dawkins' greatness was that he developed this metaphor of the selfish gene and taught us to see chickens as a chicken gene's way of making more chicken genes. So that's the view that the chicken is just a vehicle for the immortal genes. Very powerful perspective. I think it's right. So we think about the replicators, the DNA, and we think about the vehicles that the replicators use to travel through time, generation after generation. As Dawkins puts it, so vehicle selection is the process by which some vehicles are more successful than other vehicles in ensuring the survival of their replicators. The controversy about group selection versus individual selection is a controversy about the rival claims of two suggested kinds of vehicles. Genes clearly ride on from generation to generation in individual animals and plants. Nobody disputes that, obviously. The whole question before you is, do genes sometimes ride in groups? Do the genes that we have in our bodies today come down to us exclusively because they rode in successful individual humans, or pre-humans, competing with other humans? Or do they come down to us in part because they rode around in groups that successfully competed with other groups? That's the question of fact. Here are the 4 exhibits that I will show you in this legal case. The first is major transitions in evolution, which were not understood when Williams and Dawkins were writing. In between their 2 books, Lynn Margolis published her theory on the origin of eukaryotic cells, which was later developed into a theory of the major transitions in evolution. And here I think it's good to illustrate this graphically, what these are. Margolis, her explanation of why eukaryotic cells have mitochondria in them, and the mitochondria has DNA that is totally unrelated to the DNA in the nucleus, is that they used to be separate free-living bacteria. And somehow they got together, one swallowed another without digesting it. They entered a symbiotic relationship. So, in a sense, a eukaryotic cell is a group. It's a group in which separate organisms got together, and now they replicate, one for all for one. They replicate as a group. So a eukaryotic cell is a group which is a vehicle for genes. So the genes, see this later. So there are genes in here, and they don't just ride around in this mitochondrion, and this mitochondrion isn't competing with that mitochondrion. No, they ride around in this group. This is a group of creatures here. They ride around in this group, and this group competes with other groups, that is, other eukaryotic cells. So, so eukaryotic cells are an example of a major transition in which a kind of a new player takes the field, which is a group of what were previously separate organisms. I'll show you this visually now. Let's see, I think I will. What's next? Okay, so here's an animation showing what happens when you get separate organisms with now a membrane around them. And I just had a friend of mine do these animations. I deliberately made the internal organisms are blue because they are cooperative, but they are cooperative with each other. The membrane around them is green. That's the color of selfishness, because the group can be supremely selfish towards other groups, other eukaryotic cells. But the cooperation is locked inside. So all the surplus, all the wonderful productivity you get from dividing labor, that's all saved within the membrane. And this is why eukaryotic cells are so successful. Once they are invented or once they are formed, they spread throughout the earth. But this, I animated it in this way to show that this is a very general process. So here I animated it in this way to show, let me do that again. Okay, so now I want to rerun that simulation where I had the selfish, the free riders taking over before. So now with one superorganism in there, watch what happens. The superorganism, when it interacts with the selfish ones, it can crush them. It's so big and powerful. It gains resources, the selfish ones, the selfish individuals lose. This isn't a matter so much of generosity as simple size. Superorganisms are really big and powerful. And now I didn't complete the animation. I ran out of time before I showed this at the TED conference a few weeks ago. But if I were to continue this animation, what I would do is I would have occasional internal organisms morphing. I would have occasional internal cells morphing into green, which would be like a cancer. Suppose one of the mitochondria gets selfish and stops cooperating and becomes a free rider and tries to replicate itself, so like a cancer. Well, what would happen? If we had these superorganisms competing with each other, then, as in the case with the crew race, if you just kill the losing 10% every round, any cell that develops a selfish free rider is going to lose out in that competition. So the free riders can't spread through the population. They get wiped out. So that's what this is intended to show here. You can see it one more time. So this is a major transition. That is, once you get a new form of cooperation taking the field, it can be supremely powerful. And for those of you who know E.O. Wilson's work, this is what happens with the bees, ants, wasps, and termites. It's an extremely successful form of life. I think it's 2% of all the insect species, but 80% of the insect biomass are insects. And so, so the point I really want to stress here is, this is my one little flashy PowerPoint. In a major transition, groups begin to function like individuals, and in a major transition, it is indisputable, except maybe for some terminological sense, that groups do become vehicles for genes. Dawkins and Williams didn't know that, but now we do. Here's another illustration. Bees and ants don't actually, it's not that they come together as strangers, but the point is that once you get individuals bound together in a hive, then you unleash the force of cooperation. You keep the cooperation locked inside so that there's no issue of free riding. And this hive competes with other hives, and the most cohesive hives win. And now I'll show you one more time, now this time with humans. So humans are like other primates in so many ways, and I believe until 500,000 years ago we were very, very much like other primates. But then we begin to we begin to divide labor. We begin to cooperate in larger groups. We come together around. We domesticate fire, come together in larger groups, divide labor, and now we begin to get tribal markings, which you can think of as being like a wall surrounding a group. And Joe, where's Joe? Right in front of me, okay. So I mean, Joe and Natalie's book on origins of cooperation, ethnic markers, just so many things that groups do that are, in a sense, like putting a boundary around that sort of, it's permeable, but it keeps the cooperation inside, and those who can share in these tribal markings can trust each other. So I just want to show it's a very general process. When evolution finds a way, be it biological evolution or cultural now, finds a way to put a membrane around, as it were, you get a group, and it generates vast wealth, safety, success, and so the genes that are in that group ride on into the next generation in the safety of the group. And individuals that are not in good groups like that, they don't make it. So groups become vehicles. Cultural evolution has hit on many kinds of vehicles. The sort of the natural form of religious worship is circling, literally circling. Raise your hand if you've been to Burning Man. Okay, that's, what do? You say, God, I can't believe I thought you guys on the West Coast were all so cool and hip. Okay, all right. So there's something literally about circling that is just deeply appealing. And when groups get together and make up rituals, they very often will include circling around something. It just feels good to us to circle around. So we don't always have to circle. Here's another example of a superorganism. The reason, I'm not no historian, but as I understand it, one of the reasons why Alexander was able to conquer the known world and defeat much larger armies was that he hit on this innovation, which is if you line your soldiers up in this form, they're like a gigantic millipede, and it's terrifying to face, and they can just march through a much larger army. They're so cohesive, they win. So again, in history, and there are several historians have been writing about this, Peter Turchin for one, that history is basically, military history at least, is very much Darwinian. That is, cohesive groups beat less cohesive groups. So Exhibit A is the major transitions. So just to draw out a few implications, major transitions are rare. The first list was listed only 7. Now some lists up to about 15 or 18 of them having occurred in the history of life. They're rare, but when they happen, they are revolutionary. I mean, they can transform the planet. Why do we have flowering plants on Earth? Well, it's because the bees got this transition and changed the biosphere. You can't evaluate human evolution by comparing us to other animals that have not gone through the transition. So almost all the examples in those 2 books by Dawkins and Williams are irrelevant. As Williams put it, a fleet herd of deer is really just a herd of fleet deer. That's true, but there's no reason to compare us to deer. Would you say that a cohesive tribe of humans is really just a tribe of cohesive humans? That doesn't make sense. So we are different. Human groupishness is different, it's unique. So the question before you is, can human groups be vehicles? Now here's, the other exhibits are shorter, mostly just because I didn't really have the time to really do these up properly. But they're all described in chapter 9 of my book. So why are we different? What makes human groups different? The work of Mike Tomasello just really blew me away, and it changed my thinking. I used to think that we were very, very similar to chimpanzees in our sociality, and obviously we are in most respects. But when it comes to morality, I think we're very, very different. They have some of the building blocks that we do, but I think we have some that they do not have. And this line especially from Tomasello that I've seen him give in talks. It is inconceivable that you would ever see 2 chimpanzees carrying a log together. Now these are brilliant creatures. They're Machiavellian. They can do social cognition. They can guess the intentions of others. They're brilliant as individual thinkers, but they cannot put their heads together, even for something as simple as, let's bring this over, then we can climb up and get out. They can't do that. Tomasello, in a brand new article in, I think, Current Anthropology, I'm not sure, he lays out what he calls 2 steps to ultra-sociality. So the first, in Tomasello's story, is joint foraging. So chimps never do joint foraging. They never work together, whereas they could greatly boost their productivity, and one could pull down a branch, the other gets the berries, and they could share them. But chimps can't do that. They can't share. They can't work together. But humans are incredibly good at it, even as young as 2 or 3, when kids work together on a project. If they both work together to create a benefit, they share it naturally, easily, very little fighting. So Tomasello's story is that human beings began doing more joint foraging, and once they were beginning just doing a little of it, there's such a benefit to working together that those who could do it and recruit good partners got lots of food, had more kids, and that ability spread throughout the human lineage. So that's the first step, being able to be on the same page. And a crucial point: this is not a result of language. This is a cause of language. You can't do language until you get this, because language is is not a relationship between a thing in the world and a sound. Language is a relationship among people. It's a convention among people about what is in our world and how are we going to refer to it when we talk to each other about that. So this comes before language. It's not caused by language. So once we get this ability to share intentions and work together and be on the same page, then groups can get much larger. And as groups get larger, now groups are growing, taking more territory, bumping up against neighboring groups. Now you've got the competition of group versus group. And as Tomasello says, as Darwin says, cohesive cultural groups win. Now this is a lot of this is cultural evolution. But Tomasello calls it even biological selection for greater group-mindedness. So as long as you have groups now getting sort of on the same page, having shared cultural representations, growing, competing with other groups, now the most fit groups are going to win. And fitness is a combination of having the genes that give you brains that are good at culture and groupishness, plus having developed cultural institutions that work well to keep you guys together, including, for example, things like religion or very early proto sort of religions. So this is Tomasello's story about shared intentionality, and I think it's a crucial part of the story that, again, Dawkins and Williams just could never have guessed. They did not think this way. Now I'll just bring in E.O. Wilson's big idea, which I think is so helpful, that ultrasociality in every species, he says, every single species, including us, every species that has it, it's not caused by some super degree of relatedness. No, it's caused by having a shared defensible nest. I was just reading him saying something about, there's this one species of woodpecker that bores into live trees, which takes years. Normally they just sort of bore into dead wood, doesn't take that long. But if one species in the south bores into live trees, it takes years to make a nest. Well, if it takes years to make it, then, again, it's a very expensive nest. That's the only species of woodpecker that has the young staying behind after they hatch to help care for other young. So they're making the transition to ultrasociality like bees. So the key is a persistent, defensible, the behavior protects a persistent, defensible resource from predators, parasites, or competitors. The resource is invariably a nest plus dependable food within foraging range of the nest inhabitants. No exceptions. So I just want to make the point that caves, I mean, obviously we find all kinds of relics of early humans in caves, and that's not a random process. They're preserved better there, so we can't conclude from that humans are always living in caves. But if you can imagine living in the wild where it's cold and there are predators, and there are also some caves, where are you going to live? It seems to me that a cave is a pretty desirable piece of real estate. And once you have humans living in caves and working together to defend them, perhaps make some minor improvements, or at least make hearths, whatever it is, you have the same logic that you have with all the other animals. A shared defensible nest which you work to improve, and now it's really adaptive for the young to stay behind and all work together to raise the next generation. So it's possible that caves really were, a kind of a little, like the seed crystal put into our evolution that allowed certain kinds of relationships to flourish. So implications, humans seem to be following the same path as all the other ultrasocial creatures, which is that we seek out or we create shared defensible nests. And once humans became cumulatively cultural creatures in the last 500,000 years or so, at least that's the number given by Boyd and Richardson, and they could improve their physical nests and begin to make symbolic nests. So we now live not just in these physical buildings that we've created, but we have cultures. We have group identities that protect us, give us access to resources. So we make nests that we can carry around with us that are not entirely physical. All right, Exhibit C, genes and cultures co-evolve. And here I did such a poor job with this section with Joe Henrich sitting right in front of me. So this is embarrassing, but just a quote from Richardson and Boyd on the tribal instincts hypothesis, talking about as humans begin to get more tribal, doing more group marking. Such environments favored the evolution of a suite of new social instincts suited to life in such groups, including a psychology which expects life to be structured by moral norms and is designed to learn and internalize such norms. New emotions such as shame and guilt, which increase the chance that the norms are followed, and a psychology which expects the social world to be divided into symbolically marked groups. So this whole period from 500,000 years ago through 70,000 years ago, before we begin leaving Africa. This is I don't know the course, but it's somehow during that period we get the ability to become really cultural creatures who do a lot of group marking. We get our tribal instincts. This is a very long period in which I believe we evolved some new modules, some new emotions, there are precursors in chimpanzees. Submission is going to be related to shame. It's not that we evolved something from nothing, but we really veer off and become psychologically very, very different from any other creature that has ever existed during this period. We become tribal. We become very groupish. As this is going on, now you've got tribes competing with tribes. Social selection speeds up. That is, in a tribal environment, who gets married or who has children. It's not the psychopath who is not groupish, not tribal, not loyal. No, that person gets expelled or killed. As Chris Bohm says, we begin doing social selection for being able to follow the rules, for being a good group member. And so we auto-domesticate ourselves, we tame ourselves, and our bodies show many of the same signs of auto-domestication, that is, we look more juvenile. Just as bonobos are more juvenile compared to chimpanzees, same process with us. We and bonobos are similar, not because we're more closely related, but because both species seem to have gone through a process of auto-domestication in which there was selection against internal violence, and we become more peaceful. So you've got social selection going on. You've got cultural group selection speeding up as our minds get more cultural. There's a race between groups for successful tribalism. And during this very long time, there has to be shaping of genes. This can't just be cultural selection and cultural group selection. It would be bizarre to think that the genes would just be sitting still during this very long period. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that tribes became, in the last 500,000 years, especially the last 100, 150 probably, tribes became vehicles. The genes that we have in us are not just because our great-great-great-grandfather beat out the guy next to him. It's because his group beat out the group next to it. So that's my claim. Last exhibit, evolution can be fast. So the general view in the social sciences and biology has been that for human evolution, at least, there's been not much change. I mean, that evolution in the last 10, 20,000 years is not something we need to think about. As Stephen Jay Gould put it, there's been no biological change in humans in 40 or 50,000 years. Everything we call culture and civilization, we've built with the same body and brain. Wishful thinking, as I said in my talk this morning, every group holds something sacred. In the academic world, where just about everybody is liberal, people who lived through the 60s and 70s, I think, hold race issues are the most charged area where there's all, so you plant a flag in the ground, you say there are no race differences, and then that means, then you reason out from there. If there are no race differences, then there can't have been evolution in the last 50,000 years. That, I believe, is why this view was held. There's no evidence for this. I mean, Darwin knew, he talked to plant breeders and animal, evolution can be very, very fast. Darwin knew that, and most of you know about the Belyaev fox experiments. In 10 generations, you get clear behavioral and morphological changes. In 30, you get essentially a new species. Now, that's with very strong selection pressure, but still, the point is genetic evolution is much, much faster than Gould thought. In fact, now we're beginning to get some indications. I mean, there are different methods, but there are some indications that this pace of genetic evolution sped up in the Holocene. This is a very important study by Hawkes and others, where you can estimate based on, as when you sequence the genome of a lot of people, you can tell which genes were sort of pulled along by selective pressures because they drag along other bits of DNA in meiosis versus which ones are moving around just from random drift. And so they have a method of calculating the number of genes that appear to be under selective pressure and when they began moving through populations. And what they conclude is that you've got a pace of selective pressure applied to the human genome through here, and then it begins accelerating after 40,000 years, and it reaches a pinnacle in the Holocene. Well, of course it does. Once you have agriculture, you have much increasing group size. Well, first of all, it has to speed up. Humans leave Africa. We have all kinds of diverse environments. We have increasing population sizes. We have new technologies, new diseases. I mean, all this stuff going on, all these new selective pressures, of course evolution is speeding up. So the lesson that I would like to give to the graduate students here is if you're interested in evolution, stop focusing so much on the Pleistocene. The Holocene is the new Pleistocene. That's at least my prediction. And if Hawkes et al. Are right, because they say that, according to their graph here at least, the pace of evolution sped up 100-fold. That means that in the last 15,000 years, there's been as much evolution as in the last 1.5 million before that, which means that the Holocene could literally be as important for our genomes as the entire Pleistocene, almost all the Pleistocene. Now, that's probably not the case, but the point is the Holocene ain't trivial. A lot of genetic change happened in the Holocene, I think. I mean, it's debated in terms of methods, but that's what I think is going on. So I'd like to sum up now, and then I'll stop talking. I have some stuff I can say about Hive psychology, but I don't want to overwhelm you. I want to just, after these 4 exhibits, let's talk about this. So I think the prosecution's case has collapsed. The most important argument that they always made was that the free rider problem dooms altruists. Well, it doesn't, because humans, it dooms it in species that can't solve it. But humans are really, really good at solving free rider problems. That's much of what morality is. Second, it was thought that warfare was not frequent until recently, but for those of you who read either Keeley or Steve Pinker's new book, you know that no, actually, we've been subject to so much warfare. And Sam Bowles has some models showing how this could affect genetic evolution and group selection even. So the new thinking since the 90s is, wow, actually, we really have been subject to lethal violence and all kinds of intergroup competition for a very, very long time. It was thought that humans are like other mammals, and so we can look to scrub jays and gerbils and all kinds of other examples, as in the books by those naturalists. But no, we went off on a really unique track once we became cultural creatures, gene-culture coevolution. Fourth, eusociality is explained by the genetics. No, it's not. The genetics, at least the haplodiploidy, it turns out to be a consequence of what's needed to keep the nest going. Now, I don't agree with E.O. Wilson that kin selection has produced meager results. I'm not, that 150 biologists who disagreed with him on that, I'm not on his side. Not that I have any right to be on anyone's. I don't understand the math at all, so I can't really weigh in. I'm just saying, I think that, just that eusociality is caused by haplodiploid is not true. It's actually caused by shared defensible nests, and this suddenly gives us a much tighter link between bees and humans. Not that we are descended from bees, but we are shaped by the same process that they were, which is evolution to protect the shared defensible nest. And lastly, there's not been enough time. No, there's been a lot of time. 150,000 years is plenty of time for new abilities, new emotions, new tribal instincts, and 10,000 years is plenty of time, not for new modules, but for just adjusting those settings, for being more or less aggressive, more or less prone to magical thinking. I mean, there's all sorts of little levers that you can move up or down in that amount of time. So let me stop there, because I imagine there's plenty to say, plenty of objections, and we'll see if I have time to get into Hive psychology. What do you think about my case so far? Let's take a vote. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how do you find? Do you believe that groups have been vehicles used to convey human genes down to the present generation? Raise your hand if you say yes. Raise your hand if you say no. Okay. So far it's a majority, although I don't know what the laws are in terms of, well, I would guess, so in psychology we have p less than 0.05 and we stick to it in a magical thinking sort of way. I think most important questions should be decided by p less than 0.5, in which case I win this argument. No, right. Okay, so what do you think? Questions, comments, criticisms? Yes, Joe.
No, I think the key thing you have to distinguish is two different kinds of hypotheses. One is that you had cultural group selection, altering the selection.
We surely did.
Groups
yes.
That can create all kinds of fancy gene cultural coevolution. So things like shame and in-group favoritism and all that stuff without the between-group variance ever having been particularly important. And one of the key reasons I think to be skeptical of between-group variances is you cited Keeley there. And if you go to those reports of between-group competition, what happens is the males show up, and when they win,
right, they take the females,
and they take all the females as concubines and wives, which creates massive gene flow between these groups and will eliminate any kind of genetic variation.
Okay, so this is what I don't understand. I was talking with your grad students before. I mean, as I understand it, it's a question of how strong are the different levels of selection. But they were talking about it as though if there's any gene flow, it just blows it away and there can't be group selection. I don't understand that.
No, not any gene flow. This is remixing the groups completely. Right? Taking all the females from one group and bringing them in as reproductive partners in the group. So that's super high migration, super high gene.
Right, I see, okay.
And the other thing would be, so what are the empirical implications of these two hypotheses? And I mean, so one thing about the world, if you look at the ethnographic record, is that you do have groups that don't have any kind of hive-like behavior. So groups like the Machiganga that I lived with live in single families scattered throughout the forest. There's no hive, and they don't have norms for cooperation. There's all kinds of cooperative opportunities that they fail to take advantage of.
Okay, but so I assume there's not a lot of intergroup competition. Is there a lot of warfare among them?
Well, they have a long tradition of trying to escape from people who were trying to enslave them.
Okay. Okay. So, so depending on the local ecology, whenever intergroup competition is ramped up. My guess is that they have all the same latent modules and systems that we have, and so if you put them into a situation where there was intergroup skirmishes and increasing, that they would be able to do all this stuff. But as far as I'm concerned, if there are some tribes here and there that have been turned down on the settings for that, and it could even be genetic. I'm just saying it could. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying we have this tendency to say, well, if the Machiganga don't do it, then it's not innate. Whoa, what's that? Do you guys do like robotic intelligence here? What is this? So anyway, I just want to make this clear to everyone that when we talk about innate, on the old model where there's been no evolution in 50,000 years, if the Machiganga don't do it, then it ain't innate. Well, actually, even so, yeah. But on the new model,
what you need are some predictions that separate the two hypotheses.
Okay. And so wait, the two hypotheses are what?
Cultural group selection plus all kinds of gene culture coevolution that just wasn't driven by between group genetic areas. Yeah. And the other one is that where things were driven by between group genetic areas.
Okay, thank you. So that's very helpful because I think that if you put like the Dawkins position here and then me and Davison Wilson position here, I think the evidence pretty clearly points to this side. But you're proposing an explanation which I think gets you most of the way there.
And this is what Boyd and Richardson also defended.
Okay, so Boyd and Richardson, yes, but in some conversations, I think Pete Richardson believes that there's been some genetic group selection. Is that correct?
I don't know. I don't think so, but sometimes he's soft.
Okay. So thank you. But yes, clearly, what I'm going to have to do. Thank you. So what I'm going to have to do before I debate Dawkins is come up with the most compelling story in which you get gene culture, you get cultural group selection, which everybody agrees. I think everybody agrees. I certainly do. And you get gene culture coevolution, and that can probably do a lot of the work without saying that there's been any group selection. Okay.
And you also need some story to deal with this other problem I mentioned about this. I mean, the more intention in intergroup competition, the more you swamp the genomes among different tribes.
Right. Okay. So here's where I think the vehicle replicator thing helps, because some versions of group selection, which Dawkins is very opposed to, and I think is okay, is very opposed to, treat groups as replicators. And if you're going to treat the group as the unit of information which replicates itself, then the gene flow would devastate that. So I don't mean that. I mean the genes are moving around, and then there's this distinction that I don't fully understand, although I talk about it in an extended footnote. There's a book by Okasha called The Levels of Selection. I can't remember the title, but there's a very long footnote in chapter 9 of my book. We distinguish between MLS1, in which genes are, the groups are constantly shifting. They don't have to be stable groups over time. And then MLS2, which is the situation you're referring to, which is where the group is stable and the group competes with other groups and they live or die as a group. So I fully agree that humans are not at that stage. We are not the Borg, we are not a beehive, we are not obligatory groupish creatures in that sense. So I need to flesh out the MLS1 distinction more clearly. Thanks. Okay, yes?
You might have mentioned this and I necessarily caught it or something, but I was curious why you believe that shared intentionality predates language.
Because, so this is just straight from Tomasello. He says this, that efforts to teach chimps and other animals language have not really worked. I mean, they can communicate, they can develop, but some language, there's something that they're not getting. And Tomasello, it's like when you read his work, like when you really get this idea about how just effortless it is for us to be on the same page, he has an image of almost like a piece of paper that we're both working off of right now, and we're all working off of a few pieces of paper about norms, what we're doing here today, what the norms are. I mean, we're all on the same page on this. It's only once you get that you can have language as an agreement among the individuals for how we're going to communicate with each other. And actually, so I got a 16-page email from Steve Pinker critiquing this chapter. But one of the things he did say was that he agrees with Tomasello and me on this, that shared intentionality precedes language and doesn't, it's not a result of it. I'm sorry, that was an appeal to authority. That's terrible. I shouldn't have done that. Well, read my chapter and then go read Tomasello. That's all I can say. Okay, yes?
I've been following the group selection debate for a while, and I share your perspective. But and remember, Steve Gould actually argued multi-level in at least his last book. So although you have him on sort of the other side, I think he was a proponent back in...
For human beings? He thought that human beings evolve, or just in general other animals?
And I presume he would include humans in the evolution on the planet. So
Okay.
I'm actually interested in stepping back. You probably mentioned this in your book, in the introduction, but I'm interested to know why you care about this question.
Why I care about this much? So some of you know I'm interested in, I got into this to study cultural variation in morality. And if you're studying weird morality, if you're studying Lawrence Kohlberg's and Carol Gilligan's morality, you don't need any of this stuff. And this is part of the age of methodological individualism. If morality, is just me cooperating with you and exchanging whatever, you don't need any of this stuff. But there's all this weird stuff that we do that I think is very hard to explain. So I've been interested in conservative morality, traditional moralities. So for example, I opened the chapter with a description of what I felt after 9/11. I had this urge to put a flag on my car. And it's weird. It was embarrassing. Because I'm a professor. I'm not going to put a flag on my car. People would think that I was a Republican. And so what I did finally was I put an American flag in one corner, and I put a UN flag in the other to reassure people. Okay, but so I was not under cultural pressure to do this. I was going against cultural pressure to wave the flag. I just felt like I had to show the flag. Similarly, and how did that evolve? I mean, is that because individuals here's another example. There's a really strong urge to kill traitors and apostates. They have to be killed, not just fined or killed. Now, how did that, and you read the Quran, it's all over the Quran, and you see it in a lot of places. How did that evolve? Do you think that whatever the genetic basis is of this urge, let's just, if you join me in thinking that we're massively modular minds, there's all these instincts and buttons and levers, whatever, in human nature, how did that one evolve? Was it because individuals who were strongly motivated to murder cheaters and apostates had more surviving children than the next guy who didn't try to kill cheaters and apostates? I don't see how that could happen. Or is it that groups that co-evolved tribal markers and all sorts of the tribal sentiments of killing cheaters and apostates, those groups are the ones that spread and we are descended from them. So that is group selection. In other words, this broader, it seems ugly to modern secular liberals. This is hideous. This is close to Nazism. This is racism and genocide. There's all this bad stuff. But this is much of human morality, and I want to study it, and I can't understand it using the Dawkins framework. I probably could understand it using Joe's. I probably could do that. But it just, once I think about the constant group versus group, it just goes down.
So just to follow up, so in terms of now, and the evolution of society and us now, how do we bring that ethos into these questions that we're facing now?
How do we bring, so...
just understanding that that's how we got here, and that's who we are. Obviously, that's really important and relevant, but more specific.
Right. So I think there's a big payoff in understanding this. So David Sloan Wilson has a book last year, The Neighborhood Project. And in it, he cites a lot of work by Elinor Ostrom, got the Nobel Prize, for looking at how small groups or groups are able to solve like cooperative fisheries. They're able to basically create moral order and put restraints on behavior. And a lot of it fits within MLS framework. It's sort of like if you think about, I should have the list somewhere of these design principles, but if you think about us as being we're competitive with each other, but as soon as there's competition of us versus them, then we cooperate really well. And if you have the methodological individualism framework, where we're just each out for ourselves, and you got to make it worth my while to cooperate with you, you can't solve a lot of problems. But there are a lot of principles. So I'm in a business school now, and I'm teaching some MBA classes, and people who go into business, they're different from us academics. They probably joined fraternities when they were in college, and a lot of the pleasure is working as a team. And when you get team versus team competition, people love it. It's fun. So there's a lot of principles of designing groups or designing effective institutions that I think can be improved by understanding multi-level selection as our origin story. I have a website at ethicalsystems.org, which is just beginning, but I'm trying to lay out what we can take from the social sciences to design systems that will end up producing ethical behavior indirectly. So at least one small response to your question, we have all these ethical meltdowns in the corporate world, and then the response is always teach the MBAs more ethics. Well, that's a complete waste of time. There's nothing, you can't teach ethics in a class. But I think we can use this framework to teach MBAs how to structure their companies and their teams when they go out into the work world so that they'll get better results. Yes?
I have a couple comments, so I was hoping you could just elaborate on a little more. First comment is you said cohesive groups, like more cohesive groups beat other cohesive groups. I was just wondering how that kind of fits in with America, since American culture is very like individualism, and what you're also talking about before about how we focus more on the individual. Perhaps this also could be a reflection of that kind of autonomous focus. And so that's number one. Number two.
I'm not going to limit you to 2 just because my attention span is declining.
Okay. And another point I just wanted to ask about was the cave analogy, how you talked about how the cave kind of influenced.
Might have. I'm being speculative here, but I'm just linking this to the E.O. Wilson argument.
Okay, yeah, because I know like recently they've like really connected like circular kind of structures, like codes and caves to produce kind of more comfort and safety, like it unconsciously affects. Oh,
you mean kind of like a biophilia type, like we're attracted to those settings?
Yeah, we're naturally attracted to those settings, so I don't know if that like has an unconscious representation.
Right. Okay, so first, as for what's going on with a country like America where people are individualistic, well, the first thing is we evolved to live in tribes which have this internal recursive structure, clans within larger, so we're good at that. And there's that Arab proverb, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me and my brother and cousin against the stranger. So it's that recursive structure, we're really good at it. And I think nation state is the largest level that we can go up to. Now, all of this stuff was shaped by gene culture coevolution or whatever process before there were nation states. According to Peter Turchin and others, these early city-states might have been truly competing. They didn't usually wipe each other out, and all the problems that Joe. But once you get city-states and then nation-states, the story kind of changes. Because like America now, it's not like we beat Russia and therefore we take their territory and maybe their women. Well, actually, I guess we are taking their women. That's another story. But that's economic. So these processes are not necessarily going on in the present day. But Americans, while they're individualistic, they're also very patriotic, and but it varies, of course. On the right, they're very patriotic, and on the left, they're more ambivalent about America and its history. So all I would say is that we are running nation states using this old tribal psychology, and I think that actually helps us understand a lot, like the need to display the flag. It's not all the time, but when my tribe was attacked, which has only happened twice in the last 150 years, when my tribe was attacked, I had this overwhelming unconscious or overwhelming urge to display the flag. Yes?
Yeah, I'm pretty convinced by your case for the groups being the carriers, but I'm wondering whether it has to be an either-or situation where the vehicles for the replicators are either groups or individuals.
Oh no, it's mostly individual. The great majority of evolution is individual.
But could it be there will be certain groups that are most cohesive or they share some group level traits that enables that group to dominate or succeed. But then at certain points, groups do sort of meld together, and at that point there might be various issues at the individual level, so that certain members from this group, certain individuals from the other group, and then you've got sort of this new group, and then after that fusion has taken place, though, then the group is perhaps even more cohesive, so they're able to succeed, and later on they might amalgamate with another group. So it's kind of back and forth.
If you get bigger, get bigger or get out in the business world. As groups come together, they can form a more cohesive empire or something like that. Is that what you're suggesting?
No, well, the idea was when two or more groups amalgamate into one, then there's, so to speak, within the group, competition at the individual level, so that certain individuals will sort of be able to continue in the group, whereas other individuals will only their genes will only have a limited time within.
I'm not really following, except to say that in modern times, I mean, I think it's in a democratic society, I think it is really good and healthy to have lots and lots of groups that are cross-cutting. And the situation where all groups are perfectly nested is the more volatile and dangerous one, in which you can get, like Bosnians, I mean, you can get really nasty tribal fights. I think on the left, people are often wary of our groupishness, and they want to sort of suppress it. But I've read some accounts in which the best way forward is celebrate our groupishness and encourage it, but just make sure that there's lots of cross-cutting groups. My point is that when groups meld, I think that's what you're getting at, when groups meld, if it's in multiple different ways, I think that actually gives us the benefits of groupishness without a lot of the risks of sort of nasty intergroup conflict. Okay, yes?
Hi, there's a lot of talk now like sub-single cell intentionality.
What? Sub-single cell, what does that mean, intentionality?
Mitochondria actually cooperating in certain ways and repeating in certain ways to further the processes of the cell. So if it gets down that small, then what are we talking about in terms of cooperation? What does cooperation mean then?
Well, the biologists would have one meaning of it that would sidestep any issues of intentionality or consciousness. And I hope I hope you're not attributing consciousness or true intentionality to them. Right, okay, yeah, right, okay. So, I mean, to the extent that evolution is a very general paradigm, whenever you've got competition, variation, and heritability. So if it turns out, I mean, as I understand it, our the immune system has this sort of an evolutionary aspect to it as well. I mean, of cells sort of competing and replicating based on certain rules. So I could believe that mitochondria are competing or cooperating. It's just if their replication meets the criteria, Darwin's 3 simple conditions for an evolutionary system. Beyond that, I can't say. But if there's a simple citation or complex citation, you can send me. Please do. Okay, thanks. Yes.
So when you're speaking of groups, you've mentioned tribes, nation states, religious groups, mitochondria in a eukaryotic cell.
Multi-level. That's my middle name.
But I'm sort of wondering what it takes to be a group, such that you can be a group that is selected. Right. That selection acts upon.
That's a good question. I think that gets to the heart of this MLS1, MLS2 distinction. So what Okasha says is that at the beginning of a major transition, groups can shift around, and David Sloan Wilson calls these trait groups. So if a few of us are trying to get something done and we cooperate, and we're more successful than some other group, and then we break up and I go to a different group of people that's trying to get something done, and we're successful. Genes for groupishness in me can spread because I get a little bump from all these different groups I'm participating in. So in that sense, a group is not very cohesive. It just has to stay together long enough for at least one round of competition. And as long as you've got, so humans benefit a lot from taking part in that sort of groups. Chimps and other animals, that's not so much. I mean, there are dyadic coalitions. We know from DeWall, and they do politics. They do a little bit of it. So that's the beginning. Now, later on in the major transition, the group is truly cohesive, one for all for one. That's when the mitochondria are locked inside the membrane. Human groups are never like that. Some people, I forget who it says, the guy Stearns, I forget his first name, we are stalled partway through a major transition. We are not the Borg from Star Trek, we are not bees. So we have gone through MLS1, and there might have been brief periods of time in our evolution where the genocide and war was so intense that we were sort of briefly, maybe there were some periods where it really was wiping each other out. But if it was always the case that you take the women in, then it wouldn't be. So my guess is that we're just MLS1. We never really got to MLS2. Yes?
It seems like if groups have hierarchies, some groups have more status, or some individuals in the group have more status than others, then those individuals who have more of the groupish traits you're talking about would individually benefit beyond what they get from being part of a group. So then wouldn't that argue that in addition to group selection, there's individual selection within groups for having more of groupish traits?
Oh, yes. I think that individual selection is generally more important. It explains most of our nature. And a lot of so the real test would be this. To the extent that people display signs of loyalty, patriotism, groupishness, all that sort of stuff, to the extent that they pretty much do it only when others are looking or when they can get some benefit, then maybe you could explain the whole thing that way. But to the extent that people do it even when they're not going to benefit, they just feel motivated to do it regardless of the circumstances, then that would at least indicate that this was not this sort of Machiavellian groupishness or strategic groupishness. And so that's, my example of wanting to display the flag. I mean, that was, it was a little embarrassing. So yeah, and again with the either or question, most of the story is always individual level. The question is, was there some degree of group selection, which I think explains. So I'll just show you. So I'll just give you one example of the payoff. Like, why would you do this? Can't we explain it all through the mechanisms that Joe mentioned? Well, what really got me into this is what I've been calling Hive psychology. And the reason, I'll just very, very quickly, how much time do we have? We have 15 minutes. So I'll take five or 7 minutes now to show you this. So I was studying all these moral emotions and moral elevation, and then that got me into awe. And there's just like all these things we do, all these times when we seem to lose ourselves. The self seems to shut off. Religious conversion experiences, William James wrote about these, the loss of self. In nature, Ralph Waldo Emerson, all mean egotism vanishes. Again, the loss of self, shut off the self. In meditation, as a technology developed over a couple thousand years for making the self disappear. Psychedelic drugs were so popular in part because you can achieve in 30 minutes what it would take years of meditation to achieve otherwise. And then repetitive movements are also widely used. So cultures, religions, they have all these different ways of shutting off the self. Isn't that interesting? What's the purpose? What's the function of that? So the breakthrough for me was reading this book by William McNeill called Keeping Together in Time. And McNeill describes how when he was a soldier in basic training, drafted into the Army at the beginning of World War II, out on his base in Texas, they just marched up and down the field all day. He thought it was stupid. Just because they didn't have guns, that's why they're just making us march, because they can't actually give us practice shooting, so they're just making us march. But then, when his unit got it, when they could move and turn on a dime, and they really had a sense of, like, we are one, functioning as a single unit, he said, words are inadequate to describe the emotion aroused by the prolonged movement in unison that drilling involved. A sense of pervasive well-being is what I recall, a strange sense of personal enlargement from collective ritual. So I think I have a video here to show you. So this is a passage that I've animated from a book about war.
Many veterans will admit that the experience of communal effort in battle has been the high point of their lives. I passes insensibly into a we. My becomes our. An individual fate loses its central importance. I believe that it is nothing less than the assurance of immortality that makes self-sacrifice at these moments so relatively easy. I may fall, but I do not die. For that which is real in me goes forward and lives on in the comrades for whom I gave up my life.
Okay, when I say I animated, what I mean is I paid somebody to make this great video. But that is from a book called The Warriors by Jesse Glenn Gray, who describes, he was in World War II, he interviewed a lot of other combat veterans. And again, they have this ability to lose themselves, not so much for the country, it's really for the buddies, it's for the small group. They're very, that's what's so intense about war and what makes it so thrilling and even pleasurable for many soldiers. That's the passage that I just showed you. So, the Hive psychology hypothesis, this is one of the metaphors of my book, is that human nature is 90% chimp, 10% bee. So we're primates, we do all the same stuff that other primates do. But we also have this recent overlay in the last 500,000 years, maybe especially last 100,000. But we were subject to, I think, a little bit of group selection, group level selection, which sort of maybe gave us some new abilities or modules, or at least just tuned up some existing settings so that we were better at doing this. If you read De Waal, and of course De Waal can get a lot of goodness out of chimpanzee, although some people think he goes too far. But we have the ability, under special circumstances, to forget our self-interest and lose ourselves in something larger than ourselves. So this is what really interests me. why do we do this so much in so many different ways, in almost every culture? Why do we do this? And it's hard for me to believe that individuals who could lose themselves and forget about their self-interest and feel part of something, they just went on to beat out their neighbor. They were able to, screw that guy and have more kids. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. But groups that had a lot of people who did this, and then they had a religious technology that did this, that was one of the keys to human cohesiveness. And so we're very good at every man for himself. We're also very good at one for all for one. Now this is a really fun video. If you want to see this, just as sort of an example of how this works and how it might be adaptive, this is from the New Zealand rugby team, the All Blacks. So watch what they do before each game, and then pity their poor opponents. Oh, wait, hold on a second.
And as the smoke continues to hang around Eden Park, the All Blacks prepare to do the haka.
This is a Maori war dance that they've adapted. So again, I think if you just step back and look at human nature, human social nature, human moral nature, it's really, really groupish. And I think it's extremely... I don't know. But anyway, so it's just an example. It's just, I think it may have... so just this is my last slide. Again, I think just this general perspective that Darwin put forth, that intergroup competition has been really important for making us who we are. And I think we see it all around us, but keep in mind, all around us is the worst possible place to look on Earth because we are a weird society. So, it's least true of us, but we are the least representative people on Earth. Okay, that's it. What a great place to stop for applause in this group. Okay, thanks. Okay. Actually, that was, I guess, Mr. Subliminal suggesting applause. We do have, what's the time we have? Do we have a few more questions, or? 7 minutes of Q&A if you want. Okay. Okay, on Hive psychology or the group level, group selection.
So I like this point, and I very much like your last point. But so the rituals you showed, I think, are a great example of why you might be suspicious about a genetic versus a cultural group selection account. Because, like, for example, military drill is a cultural evolutionary product. It's something that's very hard to invent, and they transmit it from one successful group in Europe to another successful group in Europe. And that's a Maori war ritual, which was a cultural product of a long history of warfare in New Zealand and then so these aren't things that people figure out easily. They're products of cultural evolution that took a long time to assemble, that in many ways are non-intuitive.
No, that's right. So I think the process can start with cultural group selection. But now suppose, because the good innovations get copied, and so now suppose you've got a whole island in New Guinea or someplace where everybody's doing this sort of thing, or New Zealand, everybody's doing this sort of thing. And maybe it's just cultural group selection where those that do it in a better way, they have stronger initiation rates, whatever it is, they end up winning. Maybe that's all it is. But if it goes on long enough, and by long enough I mean just 1,000 years, 2,000 years, if it goes on long enough, there's likely to be some feedback. So, okay, that's just gene-culture coevolution. But if it goes on long enough, the groups in which there's the genes give them minds that make it easier for them to do this are going to, on average, be more successful. So the groups that do it, everyone's doing it, and everyone's trying to innovate culturally. That's always going on. But as long as there's some variation, some slight variation between groups in how prone their mind is to this. Let's just take the case of what we now think of as liberals or conservatives. There's a personality dimension, and liberals and libertarians don't like this stuff, and social conservatives love it. And so a group that has more liberal dispositions in it is not going to be as successful than one that has more conservatives. Now, in a time of peace, the group full of liberals is going to be more innovative. They'll generate more wealth, perhaps. I mean, so it's not that there's a one way of being is the right way. But as long as there's genetic variation on these traits for groupishness, and we have a lot of variation among ourselves in our degree of groupishness, under some ecological context where there's a lot of intergroup war, I think, it could still count as genetic group selection.
Sure. Just one quick side point, though, is that you can still have lots of within-group selection. So if you don't, for example, if you aren't good at doing the ritual, or you don't see when it's time to act the group, you get punished by your fellow group members. That's all within-group selection.
Yeah.
So that you can still select the same kind of psychology.
I see. That's true. So social selection, once the group is selecting for groupishness, then...
Once you have a cultural norm that you must behave in a groupish way, then it's all that's right.
Okay, that's right. But that fits, okay, so that's the general approach that Darwin took, which is how do you get up to this level of cohesiveness in the first place? And his answer was always by individual level mechanisms like you had. But once, if you get up to that point, then once you get the intergroup competition going, that's going to be group selection. So I'm not, yeah, it's subtle. I'm not, and I might be wrong on that. Maybe what you're saying can explain everything. We don't have to think about this. Okay, yes, right there in the white shirt.
I think early on you said that, I think the words you used was, everybody agrees that group selection is possible. I'm just wondering, how knowable is this?
Well, by possible in theory, what we mean, and again, I don't know the whole history of the price equation, and it's just a way of modeling the transmission of traits, or the transmission of genes rather, and partitioning the variance among different levels of competition. So does anyone know the math or the history of the math more? I mean, it's just I don't know, I can't explain it any better than that. Yes?
But the point is, he doesn't seem to have presented us with a smoking gun, so what would it take to falsify it?
Oh, I see. Well, this is, so if you're in the scientific mindset of experiments and you want a disconfirming experiment, I don't think that's the right way to think about this. Just as with, what's the smoking gun for Darwin's theory of evolution? I mean, there's a lot of, it's a framework for understanding why is there the radiation of variation in biological life that there is. And I think it's the same thing here. Now, there are experiments. Just as there are experiments you can show genetic evolution in the lab, you can show group selection in the lab. But I don't think that's the right way. I think it's really ultimately a matter of coherence with human nature. And I think, again, I'm swimming upstream here because we are the least groupish tribal people. So I'm just trying to I'm saying here, Dawkins gave us this very persuasive, cohesive, metaphor-rich approach, and people loved it and took it. And I'm trying to offer another one. And then we'll see which approach explains more phenomena. I'm trying to bring in a lot of these groupish tribal phenomena that I see in other cultures, and in fraternities here, and among Republicans here. So it's kind of a coherence account. Yes?
I wanted to ask, you said that nation state's the highest level of group connection, I guess you would say. Is there something that would, I guess, motivate that, or?
Yeah, intergroup competition.
Just like competition itself, like.
Yeah, so nation states emerged in France in the 16th century. So you begin to get competition between them heating up. Before that, you had feudalism. You had feudal lords. So depending on the local political structure, the appropriate level of competition will be different. Now, right now, so the European Union comes together in part because of competition with America and Asia. Now, again, we're not in not like having nations replacing nations here. But I think the evidence is coming in that the European Union doesn't work very well as a cohesive, as a cultural unit. It works well as an economic. But do Europeans, wait a second, do Europeans have a sense of being European first? Are they willing to make sacrifices for Europe? Oh, okay, that wasn't my sense. My sense is that their national identities are stronger. Really? Oh, okay. Okay.
What about religious identity?
What about what?
Religious identity that transcend national identities.
Oh yeah, right. So Islam is
history.
Yeah, that's right. So there's nothing special about nations. I'm just saying nations are the largest level at which I think you can really recruit all those tribal sentiments. And maybe Europe will be able to do it someday, but I think it's not going to be tribal sentiments. Are Europeans tribally European, or are they tribally Italian and Swiss?
The nation that is the thing that's under attack in Europe is tribalism and supranationalism.
So what's
the European movement? Europe is mean, I've done papers on this myself, that amongst the original 12, there's 125 tribes of Europe. You can go around and see them, you can look at them, they look different. Right? And these are the people that have decided to put down their arms and cooperate as groups, right? And against their own states.
Oh yeah, as an economic unit, it's
No, it's a social unit.
Are there other Europeans here who can weigh in on this? Or is the European identity really activating the tribalness in the same way that nation states do?
Not in the same way. It's super. It's an emergent feature which it can only happen at this level. It cannot happen at you might go back. I can't see any earlier iteration.
Okay.
But it's new.
Okay. And to the extent that Europe feels like it's competing with America, then it could happen. That would be consistent with my view that nation states are. It's whatever the level of integral competition is. That's the highest level you can get at for this tribal identity. Thought there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, you're right. I think integral competition would drive it, but you can say the same thing about the United States when it first formed, right? All these different states with very different cultural identities. Right. The additional difficulty, I guess, in Europe is that you have these different languages which don't facilitate communication.
Right. Well, you got so much else going on in Europe. I mean, America's a unique case of not having a lot of sort of the natural tribal markers of race, language, religion, and therefore perhaps becoming super patriotic and sacralizing the founding fathers and the flag, and we do all this other stuff. I mean, Robert Bellah calls it the American civil religion. We have to kind of fake it because we don't have a lot of the states.
There are a lot of empires too that existed throughout time, and some of the empires have been vast, much larger than any nation state or the European Union right now. And they existed because there weren't a lot of external pressures.
Well, the Roman Empire faced a lot of external pressures, but I'd be curious to know whether the Roman Empire, everybody felt they are Roman, or whether it worked because they left, each group could keep its gods, they could, whether it's sort of like as with Europe, it sort of successfully leveraged the lower level identities and got people into a kind of a union of lower, I don't know, that's a question for historians, not for me.
Sorry, I know.
Okay, no, we're
been kind enough to give us 2 talks today. You must be exhausted, ready for a drink. So let's take it once again.